Faza'il A'maal, More Trouble Than It's Worth, Part 6, Multiple Editions, Critiques, Abandonment.
So this accusation regarding fabricated ahadith is absolutely bogus, it's got no reality to it. Accusation number 2, the Faza'il A'maal has weak ahadith. Faza'il A'maal has weak ahadith.
So here we have a delusional cult follower who clearly doesn't understand the academic rigor required in order to analyze a book. However, Dr. Turkistany does have the academic rigor to analyze this book, and that's exactly what he's done. So in this part 6, before we go directly into the literature, I have another book recommendation for you which relates directly to this particular part, which means how the book has been critiqued and the sort of detail that the author Dr. Turkistany went into in order to verify the information that he was writing. So the first thing is the history of the text. Here we have the very famous Deobandi who was mentioned in the literature review. His name is Muhammad Khalid Masood, and it states a direct quote from him on page 155. The first English translation of the Tablighi Nisab appeared in 1960, and a revised edition was published in 1980 in Lahore. These translations were published in Delhi under the title Teachings of Islam this was published in 1985. A third revised edition was published in 85 as Faza'il A'maal, and in 1987 a Karachi edition was a reprint of the 1985 edition. So he clearly showed the evolution of this text, how it was published multiple times under different titles in different years, the common feature being that it was distributed widely without critical review or edition. And then he actually makes this point, and this talks about the thing of abandonment. A further revision was made in 1995 under the same title. The 1985 edition has also been translated into French, but French and Arabic speaking Tablighis often use Nawawi's Riyadh al-Salihin. So the Francophiles or the French speakers and the Arab speakers, because they actually see the mistakes in the FA text, they abandon it altogether, and they actually quote from another book from another scholar from the 6th century. That's a little bit about the history and the various editions of the book. But now we go to the publishing houses. What is their contribution in this whole debacle? It says, this is on page 157, the various and multiple editions of the book might have served the book and contributed to its widespread fame. And an average person might think that this competition between publishing houses would mean that newer editions would be more accurate, have less error, be better edited, but this is not the case concerning this book. So despite people like Abul Hasan Nadwi writing introductions and forewords and prefaces and multiple editions through the 80s and the 90s, even to the noughties as well, they just photocopy the same old mistakes in hadith, and in an upcoming series you'll see mistakes in the Quran, glaring mistakes, and I'll give examples of that in the upcoming series. So the publishing houses are pretty guilty here. Then on page 156, so these are pages one after another, it talks about the effort that Dr. Turkistany took in order to verify his information. He says on page 156, we conducted a thorough search and could not find any such translation. So there was a translation of 2 particular chapters in the FA. We even wrote a letter to the publishing house that publishes these books, and they basically said that no such translation exists. So not only is there a mistake, and there's a slapdash approach to the publishing of this material without any critical review or revision, even if you write to the publishing houses, they themselves don't have a clue about the information they put out, meaning claims are made about translations existing, but the publishing houses themselves don't know whether these editions exist or not. Anyway, that's enough of the TJ. Let's go to this book, which is The Necessity of Hadith in Islam, by a scholar called Imad Hamda. And again, this is in every one of these episodes I'll give you a book that's a decent book of hadith that talks about the methodology, the history, the background, and other important corollary issues. But in this one, I want to talk specifically about something he mentions on page 101. So Imad Hamda, he is a specialist on a hadith master of the last 100 years, a scholar that died in 1990s called Nasiruddin Al-Albani. He did his doctoral research on that, and here he did sort of like a textbook introducing people to the science of hadiths, and he focuses a little bit on hadith rejectors as well, so it gives you a good history, and it's talking about the necessity of hadith. And here he's talking about a critique on page 101, a critique that hadith rejectors, people who think hadith is something that's not does not have authority, he gives one of their critiques. He says, hadith scholars only criticized the chains of narration and neglected the content of the hadith. So the chain of narration, which we know as isnad, asanid, has been discussed in a couple of episodes. But this criticism is the text of the hadith. In Arabic, this is known as matan, and the plural of that would be mutun. So this is something hadith rejectors did, and it says, he also argues that successive scholars were unsuccessful in recognizing deficiency in the work of early hadith scholars because they were impressed by their achievements. They treated their works as infallible. Hadith scholars were so busy with the chains of narrators and their reliability that they totally ignored the subject of the hadith. So his argument here is, the thing that he's saying here is, they deemed their works infallible, and they were so impressed with their achievements, and they focused so much upon the isnad that they didn't even bother to look at the matan, to criticize the matan. This is in a nutshell exactly what Sheikh Muhammad Zakaria is doing, and I will give you a quote in a later episode about how he's advised multiple times, he's written to and he's told multiple times to revise his work, but he doesn't. He's impressed with his achievement. This is my inference, by the way, reading from Dr. Hamda. He's impressed with his achievement. He views his work to be infallible, and that's his word, infallible. He views it to be infallible, and he just carries on without any concern for critique or intellectual rigor. And then, just to give you a bit of education as well, on page 102 and 103, he quotes a scholar that does actually perform text criticism. So they're not just looking at chains of narration, they're actually looking at texts. And he gives 5 main conditions given by one scholar called Mustafa As-Sibai, and the book is called As-Sunnah wa Makanatuha, and this is page 251, 252 in the Arabic edition. But here are 5 conditions that you should look at on the text of hadith. And this is exactly what the French and the Arab speakers were doing. They were looking at the text of the FA, they found it to be ridiculous, so they just abandoned it for Riyadh al-Salihin. Sibai's first criticism, number 1, it should not contradict reason. Number 2, it should not contradict the Quran. Number 3, it should not be a report about an event that was witnessed by a great number of people but narrated only by one, and that's known as a ahad narration. Number 4, it should not contradict well-established historical facts. And number 5, it should not promise a great reward for a small deed or a severe punishment for an insignificant mistake. They are Sibai's 5 matan criticism conditions. And this itself, The Necessity of Hadith in Islam, by this specialist on Albani and specialist on Hadith Imad Hamda, is well worth a read. Stay away from the FA and stick to good books of Hadith. Stay tuned for many more parts.